Find the most trusted reference book in the Roman world. 37 volumes, everything a person could know: astronomy, farming, metals, medicine, animals. The book educated Europe for the next 1500 years. Turn to the section on the human body and read what it says one ordinary woman can do, 1 week a month, just by walking past your field. New wine turns sour, crops she walks past become barren, grass die, seeds in the garden dry up, fruit falls off the trees, the edge goes off steel, the shine goes off ivory, mirrors go dull, and a hive of bees, if she looks at it, dies, her very look even. Read that again and notice what it is not. It is not a folk tale told round a fire. It is not a village rumor. It is not one strange man's opinion. It is the encyclopedia. It is the reference work, the settled knowledge, the thing an educated person consulted to find out how the world actually worked. The author is Pliny the Elder. The date is around 77 AD. And this book was still being copied, quoted, and taught in European universities more than 1,000 years later. Which means that for most of recorded Western history, if you looked up what a menstruating woman was, this is the answer you found. And Rome is not an outlier. That is the part that should stop you. If this were one weird empire with one weird encyclopedia, it would be a curiosity. It is not. Go anywhere on Earth to societies that had never heard of Rome and never would, and you keep finding the same idea waiting for you. So there are two things to hold on to. The first is that a doctor eventually took this belief into a laboratory and tested it, and he was not a medieval doctor, he was a modern one with a modern reputation. The second is that you have seen this belief yourself, on a screen, and much more recently than you would like. But start with the puzzle, because it is a real one. Hundreds of separate cultures, most of them with no contact at all, looked at the same ordinary biological event and independently arrived at the same conclusion. Dangerous. Keep it away from the food. Keep it away from the crops. Keep it away from us. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a conspiracy. Something about this particular event made an enormous number of unconnected people reach for the same explanation. By the end of this video, you will know what that something was and why the answer took until the 1970s to properly die. Start with the book that shaped half the planet. Leviticus sets out in plain administrative language what happens when a woman is bleeding. Not a punishment, not a moral judgment, a procedure written the way you would write a rule about storing grain. 7 days. During those 7 days, she is unclean. Anything she lies on is unclean. Anything she sits on is unclean. Anyone who touches those things becomes unclean too and has to wash and wait. The bleeding is not treated as an illness to be cured. It is treated as a contamination to be contained. And containment, in practice, means a building. Across the world, in places with nothing else in common, the same solution appears, a separate structure, away from the house where women go and stay until it stops. Different names, different centuries, same floor plan. Some of these were community spaces, and in a few societies women described them warmly: rest, company, a week off the work. But the structure is doing one job whatever the mood inside it. It is keeping something separate from the village, from the fields, and from the men. And when you line up the rules from societies that never met, the overlap is almost too neat. Do not cook. Do not touch the well. Do not enter the temple. Do not go near the animals. Do not touch a man. And do not touch the things a man uses. 4 categories, over and over: food, water, worship, and men, which tells you exactly what people believed was at risk. Not her health. Never her health. The rules are not protecting the woman from anything. They are protecting everything else from the woman. Now the honest part, because the neat version of this story is wrong, it was not universal and it was not always contempt. Some societies treated the same event as a source of power rather than a source of danger, something to be respected, and in a few cases something men were envious of. And in some of those places the seclusion was closer to a retreat than a punishment. That is real and it matters, but it is the minority. Weigh the whole record and the scale falls hard the other way far more often. The conclusion was danger and the response was distance. So the puzzle sharpens instead of dissolving. Why danger? Of all the things a human body does, sweating, sleeping, aging, healing, giving birth, why did this one, and only this one, get treated as a contaminant by so many people who had never spoken to each other? The answer is not that they were stupid. They were working with the same evidence you would have had and no way to look inside a living body. Given that, the conclusion they reached is almost reasonable. That is the uncomfortable part. Here is the whole thing, and it starts with a rule your own body still runs on. Think about every other time you have ever seen blood leave a person. A cut, a fall, a fight, a tooth, a birth, an accident with a knife in a kitchen. Every single one of those is damage. Blood outside a body means something has gone wrong, and it means it so reliably that you do not have to think about it. You flinch before you decide to. It is one of the oldest and most useful rules a brain has. Blood means injury. Injury means help or danger. Act now. And then there is one exception. In half the human race, every month for about 40 years. Blood with no wound. Nobody struck her. Nothing broke. She is not weakened. She is not dying. And by every visible measure, she is completely fine. That breaks the rule. And a rule this deep does not simply switch off when the evidence contradicts it. It demands a reason. If blood is leaving and nothing injured her, then something must be coming out of her. Not a wound. A discharge. Something the body is expelling on purpose. And a body that expels something on purpose, in the ancient understanding, is a body getting rid of something it does not want. That is what expelling is for. Sweat, vomit, pus, waste, every other example they had pointed the same way. So the logic completes itself. The body is throwing something out. Bodies throw out what is harmful. Therefore, what is leaving is harmful. Nobody had to be cruel to get there. You only have to be reasoning carefully from the only evidence available and be completely wrong. Then a second thing stacks on top, and this one is about who was doing the writing. Every text we have just looked at, the encyclopedia, the law, the medical manual, was written by someone who had never experienced this and could not observe it happening. It is hidden by definition. It happens inside a body, under clothing, in private. And the people writing the reference works had no access to it at all. They were describing something they could only ever hear about. And a process you cannot observe, cannot predict, and cannot control is, to almost any group of humans, the definition of a threat. And then the third thing, which is the one that turned a suspicion into a whole theory of the body. Somebody noticed the pattern that actually is true. The bleeding stops when a woman is pregnant, and it stops again while she is feeding a baby. So the ancient physicians drew the obvious conclusion. The blood must be the raw material. It stops arriving because it is being used to build the child and then to become the milk. That is a genuinely clever inference from real observation, and for centuries it was the standard medical explanation. Which leaves one question, and it is the question the whole belief hangs on. If that blood is the material for building a person, then what is it in the months when no person is being built? And note what the answer is not. They did not think it was dirt, and they had no idea what an infection was. What they concluded was that it was surplus, a buildup with nowhere to go, going bad inside the body like anything else left standing. Not filth, not disease, something spoiling. And spoiled things, in a world before refrigeration, were the most dangerous substance anybody knew. And once you believe an organ is producing something dangerous, you have to explain what that organ is doing the rest of the time. So the Greeks gave it a character, not a function, a character. They wrote about the womb the way you would write about an animal. It wanted things. It got restless. And if it was not satisfied, it would move, wander up through the body, press on the lungs, block the throat, and cause illness wherever it stopped. That is where the word hysteria comes from. The Greek for womb is hystera. The most enduring diagnosis in the history of medicine is, underneath, just the name of a body part. And for 2,000 years, the treatment for a woman's symptoms began by asking what her womb was up to. That is the theory. Now the bill for it, because beliefs like this do not stay on the page. The hut stops being a symbol the moment it is January, and the hut has no fire in it. In Nepal, the practice has a name, shaupati. The Supreme Court ruled it illegal in 2005. It was made a criminal offense in 2017. And women have kept dying in those huts after both dates, of cold, of smoke from the fires they light to survive the cold, of snake bites, of being alone somewhere nobody checks until morning. Read those dates again because they are not history. That is not the Bronze Age or the Middle Ages. That is a Supreme Court, a parliament, a criminal statute, and a belief old enough to be in Pliny still killing people afterwards. And Europe should not feel superior here because it ran the same system with better architecture. Women were kept from communion, kept out of churches, kept away from the making of wine and bread and cheese because everybody knew what her presence would do to it, and everybody knew it because they had read it in the encyclopedia. And a belief this convenient does not stay a belief about 1 week. It gets promoted. If a body is producing a surplus that has to be expelled before it spoils, then that body is not just different from the standard model, it is running the standard model badly. Aristotle got there and wrote it down. In his account, the male body is the finished version, and the female is the same design that did not complete, and the monthly blood is the evidence, raw material that never got turned into anything. So it stops being a rule about a week. It becomes the proof, cited for centuries by people who had read it in a book by the cleverest man they knew of, that half the population was a rough draft. But the heaviest cost was not the hut or the rule, it was the silence, and the silence worked on girls. If the thing that is about to happen to your body is dangerous and shameful and cannot be discussed, then nobody tells you it is coming. So it arrives with no warning at all, and the near universal account, written down across centuries and continents by women recalling their own childhoods, is the same sentence in different languages. I thought I was dying. Some of them believed it for days. Several of them wrote that they went looking for the wound. And here is what the silence protected. It was not the girl. A girl who has been told nothing cannot ask whether this is normal, cannot say that something has gone wrong, and cannot compare her experience with anyone else's, which means a belief with no evidence behind it could not be checked by the one group of people on Earth in a position to check it. The rule made itself unfalsifiable. That is not an accident of the system. That is the system. So by the 1800s, you have a theory that is thousands of years old, enforced by law and by architecture, taught in the finest universities, and never once tested by anybody. And then something happened that should have ended it. Science arrives. Proper science, laboratories, controls, journals, peer review, the whole apparatus built specifically to catch exactly this kind of inherited nonsense. It does not end it. It puts a lab coat on it. Summer 1919. A doctor is given a bunch of red roses and hands them to his maid to put in water. The next morning, every one of them is dead. He asks her what happened. She tells him the flowers always die when she touches them during her period. Now, the important thing about this man is not that he was superstitious. It is that he was not. His name was Bela-Schick, he was a serious pediatrician, and he is the same Schick as the Schick test, the diphtheria test that was used on millions of children. He was a real scientist with a real reputation. And when his maid told him that, he did not laugh. He designed an experiment. He had menstruating women handle flowers and compared them with women who were not. He had them handle bread dough and watched whether it rose. He wrote up what he found. The flowers wilted. The dough refused to rise. And he gave it a name, which is the moment a folk belief becomes a scientific object. He proposed that menstruating women produce a toxin in their sweat. He called it menotoxin. Pliny had said her look could kill a hive of bees. 19 centuries later, a modern doctor had arrived at the same claim with a method section. And it spread, the way an idea only can when it confirms something people already believe. Other researchers looked for menotoxin in sweat, in blood, in saliva. Papers were published. It entered textbooks. It was taught. Which is worth sitting with for a second because it breaks the story most of us carry around. We tell ourselves that superstition is what came before science, and science is what replaced it. Here, the superstition simply walked into the lab, picked up the vocabulary, and carried on wearing it. So, the obvious question is how anyone got results at all. And the answer is, not that they were lying. That is the lazy version, and it is wrong. Their results were real. Flowers really did wilt on those benches. It was bad method, and it is the most ordinary kind. Tiny numbers of people, no proper control, no blinding. The experimenter always knew which woman was which, and flowers wilt on their own. So you notice the ones that fit, and you forget the ones that do not. Nobody had to cheat. You just have to be certain of the answer before you start, and be the person deciding what counts as a result. So how long did it take to die? Not a few years, a whole scientific lifetime, long enough that people alive right now were already adults while it was still being argued in the medical press. There was still a debate about menstrual pollution running in The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world, in 1974. Physiologists were still running experiments on menstrual blood in 1977, from Schick's roses, that is very close to 60 years. 1977. There were people watching Star Wars in the cinema that year. There were computers, there was a space program, and there were qualified physiologists still checking whether women were poisonous. And the belief did not die because somebody finally disproved it. There was nothing to disprove. There had never been anything there. It died the way these things actually die. Enough people stopped finding the question interesting, and it was quietly not repeated. Meanwhile, something else had been happening, and it starts in a field hospital. During the First World War, nurses were working with a new surgical dressing material, cheap, absorbent, made from wood pulp because cotton was needed elsewhere. They started using it for themselves. That is the origin of the first mass-market disposable pad, and it went on sale in 1921, which sounds like the moment the taboo breaks, a real product in real shops that anybody can buy. It is the opposite. It is the moment the taboo gets a supply chain. Because there was a problem. Buying it required saying it out loud to a shopkeeper, usually a man, in front of whoever else was in the shop. And the whole architecture we have just spent 19 minutes on made that close to impossible. So the shops solved it without solving it. The packages were stacked on the counter in plain wrapping. You took one, you put your money in a box, and you left. No conversation, no naming it. The product existed to make life easier, and the way it was sold quietly confirmed that the thing it was for could not be said out loud. And that is the template that the advertising industry inherited and then perfected. For the next 100 years, an entire product category was sold to half the population without ever depicting, naming, or showing the thing it was for. Instead, flowers, white trousers, women laughing on bicycles, words like freshness and confidence and protection. A century of advertising for a bodily process, in which the bodily process is the one thing that never appears. And it would be a comfortable place to stop, an old belief, a silly blue liquid, we know better now. But there is one more bill, it is still being paid, and it is the reason this is worth 20 minutes of your evening. There is a condition called endometriosis. Tissue behaves as if it is where it should not be, and it can be severely painful. It affects something in the order of 190 million people worldwide, roughly 1 in 10 women. The average time from first symptoms to diagnosis is 7 to 10 years. 10 years. Not because the pain is hidden. These are people going to doctors and describing it. The single most cited reason for the delay in the research on the delay is the normalization of menstrual pain. It is supposed to hurt. Everyone says so, so nothing is investigated. And the money follows the silence. Endometriosis research has run at a fraction of 1% of a national health research budget for a condition affecting 1 in 10 women. This is the actual cost, and it is not embarrassment. A thing you cannot discuss is a thing you cannot study, and a thing nobody studies stays unknown. So the taboo did not just make people uncomfortable, it made a gap in human knowledge, and that gap is still there, and people are still sitting inside it waiting a decade for a name for their own pain. Which brings us to the thing you have already seen hundreds of times without once stopping on it. A clean white pad on a clean white surface, a gloved hand or no hand at all, a small measured jug tipped over it, and out of the jug comes liquid, bright, clear, and unmistakably blue. Nobody watching has ever been confused about what that liquid represents. Everybody knows. It is not there for clarity, it is there so that the real thing does not have to appear on the screen. It is Pliny's rule, running quietly, in a television advert inside your lifetime. The first mass-market advert to show a simple red dot instead ran in 2011. It took until 2017 for a company to pour actual red liquid onto a pad in an advert, roughly 1900 years after Pliny wrote his list. And that advert was banned on Facebook. Nobody in that meeting believed a woman could blunt a blade or kill a hive of bees. Nobody had heard of menotoxin. They were just following a rule about what can be shown, which came from a rule about what can be said, which came from a rule about what is dangerous, and that one was written down in an encyclopedia in the year 77. Beliefs do not need to be believed to keep working. They only need to be obeyed. If you want the other thing your body does that people were wrong about for 2,000 years, that video is on the screen now.